Modern jets are expensive, like really expensive, with the Lockheed Martin F-22, which is largely agreed upon as being one of the best things in the sky right now, having cost the US taxpayer, give or take, $350 million each. This, no matter how you cut it, is a simply astronomical sum of money for a single airplane. In fact, it is so astronomical that a single F-22 costs more than the GDP of some entire nations, with Kiribati, Nauru, and Tuvalu all having GDPs smaller than the cost of a single F-22. What is more peculiar, however, is that it wasn't always this way, and to see this exemplified perfectly, all we have to do is travel up the F-22's family tree for a few branches to where we find this, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, which costs a mere $110,000. So what gives? How come the price of jets has leaped so ridiculously in just a few generations? Well, look, some of it comes down to inflation, obviously. But you know what? Inflation's pretty boring. And so what we're going to be doing today is taking inflation, scrunching it up into a tiny little ball and kicking it far off into the horizon, never to be seen again. And instead, we're going to open the hood of both the P-80 and the F-22 and take a closer look at the crazy leap in technology that has added so many zeros to the price tag. So let's begin. Just before we continue with today's video, I want to talk to you about something very important, and that is your personal data. Did you know that your information is probably out there being bought and sold by data brokers? Pretty scary, right? Well, that's where today's sponsor, Incogni, comes in. Incogni is a service that helps you protect your personal data from being sold online. They reach out to data brokers on your behalf, requesting the removal of your personal info and ensuring that it stays off the market. Signing up is super easy. You create an account, you let them know whose data they're protecting, and then you grant them permission to act on your behalf. Then you just sit back and relax while they handle everything. They'll even keep you updated on their progress. It's peace of mind, so you don't have to worry about your data being out there for anyone to see. Incogni does all the heavy lifting, so you don't have to. And guess what? Incogni offers a 30-day risk-free trial. Plus, if you use my promo code Megaprojects, you get 60% off an annual plan. Just go to incogni.com/megaprojects and take your personal data back with Incogni. And thank you to them for sponsoring. And now back to today's video. Okay, let's begin by having a quick look at the historical backgrounds of both of these jets, just so that you can appreciate their technology in its appropriate context. Beginning with the P-80, which was developed during World War II and was in fact the US's first operational jet-powered fighter. It was designed under the leadership of legendary design chief Kelly Johnson, a man whose resume would later include handling the design of the U-2 and the SR-71 spy planes. Quite the resume. It was also put together very quickly, with its full design process, as in from inception to completed and fully functional prototype, taking a mere 143 days in 1943, with its maiden flight occurring on the 8th of January 1944. As for why it was designed, that was for one single reason: to close the increasingly large jet gap that was forming between the US and Germany and the UK, both of whom had been heavily purchasing jet engine technology since the 1930s, and as a result, come 1943, were on the verge of introducing their first operational jet fighters, the Me-262 and the Gloucester Meteor. The US, by comparison, despite having given it a crack with things like the Bell P-59 Air Comet, just wasn't in the same league, with that specific example being such an underperformer that it was actually slower than many of their propeller planes. Ultimately, despite entering service in January 1945, the P-80 would never see combat in World War II, but nonetheless, it had done exactly what was expected of it. It had made sure that the US kept up with the big boys of the nascent jet age. It's a similar story with the F-22 in that it was designed with technological gaps in mind, but rather than nipping a gradually forming gap in the bud, as was the intention with the P-80, the F-22 was intended to create such a gap in the US's favor by being such an incredible piece of engineering that nothing else in the sky could possibly hope to match it. Work on it was initiated in the 1980s with a view to winning the Advanced Fighter Program, a US Air Force scheme aimed at replacing the aging F-15 fleet, and its prototype, the YF-22, secured victory in 1991, leading to a very lengthy program of full development and its eventual introduction into service in 2005. But those faint echoes of similarity in their conception is where the similarities end, because the difference in capability between the two aircraft couldn't be more night and day. A P-80 squaring off against an F-22, were such a thing ever to be organized, would be a fight akin to a frail pensioner squaring off against career peak Mike Tyson. It would be total, complete, and immediate destruction. So let's now have a look at why this is the case. The P-80's design and technology were, to be fair to it, absolutely cutting edge for its time, but that time was a really long time ago. Its design featured a straight-wing configuration, which, while by no means ideal, hence every fast jet nowadays having swept wings, was very much the norm for its day, as demonstrated by contemporaries like the aforecited Gloucester Meteor, as well as the de Havilland Vampire and the Arado 234. And no further, the swept-wing aircraft of the early jet age, the Me-262, essentially only had swept wings by accident, with the move being done to move the engines back in the name of weight distribution, not to reduce drag during high-speed flight. It was just a happy accident. They discovered that after the fact. Beyond its pretty typical wings, however, the rest of the P-80 was put together in a manner which was fairly cutting edge. It had a sleek and streamlined airframe that minimized drag, and also made use of aluminium alloys for most of its construction, which minimized its weight without compromising structural integrity. But things such as that are ultimately little but the icing on the cake, mere set dressing compared to the real thing that decides performance, the power plant. And for the P-80, that was a single Allison J33 turbojet, which when given the beans produced 4,600 pound-foot of thrust, enabling it to reach a top speed of 594 miles per hour at sea level, or Mach 0.78, and 624 miles per hour at altitude, or Mach 0.95. It also allowed it to climb at a rate of 6,900 feet per minute, up to a service ceiling of 47,000 feet, all of which made it pretty brisk for its day. In terms of avionics and cockpit instrumentation, the P-80 was very simple, featuring basic flight instruments, including airspeed, altitude, and engine performance gauges, and that's about it. It had no radar, no digital flight control systems, no heads-up displays, no electronic warfare systems, no network-centric warfare systems, no thrust vectoring. It was, in essence, a jet engine with some guns and bombs bolted to it that also had a bloke that sat up front to control it all. Very simple indeed. And speaking of its guns, the P-80 armament consisted of 6 M3 50 cal machine guns up in the nose, the M3 being the 1,200 rounds per minute sibling of the M2, with which you're more than likely familiar. It had a further capacity to mount either 2,000-pound bombs or 8 HVAR rockets under the wings, both unguided. This gave it versatility to sway from its mainstay role of air-to-air combat and have a crack at ground attack when the situation called for it. Although, do note that not only were the bombs and rockets unguided, as we just mentioned, but they also had to be eyeballed by the pilot when it came time to aiming, because as it was intended as an aerial fighter first and foremost, the P-80 had no kind of dedicated bomb or rocket sight, but this was actually often the case for fighters back in the day. All in all, it was a solid bit of kit for the time. So let's now move on and have a look at the F-22 and how that stacks up in comparison. Let's begin by considering the F-22's most standout feature, one that is completely alien to the P-80, and that's stealth, i.e. the inclusion of systems and measures designed to reduce detection by radar, infrared, and other sensors. For the F-22 specifically, because it does vary between stealth aircraft somewhat, this includes things such as a coating of radar-absorbent material all over its fuselage, which reduces its radar cross-section by converting incoming radar waves into other forms of energy, such as heat. This reduces the amount of radar waves that are bounced back to the receiver, thus making it appear smaller to the operator. Then there is the shape of the airframe, as the F-22 has been designed to include plenty of smooth curves and angular surfaces, which scatter radar waves out in various directions rather than allowing them to be reflected back to the receiver, again helping it to appear smaller. Also helping the effort is an internal weapons bay, which, as the name suggests, allows the F-22 to carry its ordnance inside of itself, which is a very big and clever idea indeed, given that the external ordnance, for reasons such as an increased cross-sectional area and the addition of extra corners and edges, really ruins any effort to decrease its radar cross-section. Although, do note that the F-22 can carry extra hardware under its wings if it's really needed, so don't be surprised if you see the odd photo that doesn't match our description here. It also has a stealthy canopy, which is coated in a thin layer of metallic materials that reflect radar waves and thus prevent the cockpit and pilot's helmet from contributing to the radar signature. There are a few others that we could tell you about, but you get the idea. A lot of thought has gone into making the F-22 stealthy. As for how well all of that works, well, the answer would be it works real well. According to a study released in 2014, the F-22 has an approximate radar cross-section of between 0.0001 and 0.0005 meters squared. That's about the size of an insect. And also consider the fact that the current Russian S-400 Tramp surface-to-air missile system can only detect items that are 1 meter or larger, and you suddenly understand why stealth technology is such a big deal. And stealth is just one of the many, many areas in which the F-22 blows the P-80 out of the water. For example, its engines, two Pratt & Whitney F-119 PW100 turbofans, produce 35,000 pound-foot of torque each, which, if you happen to be wondering, makes an F-22 15.2 times more powerful than a P-80. Naturally then, the F-22 is just a tad bit more brisk than the P-80, capable to top out at speeds of 1,500 miles per hour or Mach 2.25 at high altitude and 921 miles per hour or Mach 1.21 at sea level. And if you happen to be wondering why we didn't specify the altitude that it will hit Mach 2.25 at, well, that's because we didn't want a certain detail to get lost amidst the barrage of numbers we just launched at you. The fact that it can fly way, way higher than the P-80, 65,000 feet to be precise, as compared to 47,000 feet. Oh, and while we're on the topic of engines, here's something else bolted to the hot end of the F-22's F-119 that the P-80's J-33 didn't have, and that's thrust vectoring nozzles, which give it the ability to direct its thrust in multiple different directions to massively boost maneuverability. Then we get to the F-22's avionics. And remember when we said that the P-80s were basically just a set of old-school analog dials and switches? Well, yeah, that is not the case for the F-22, which, at risk of overhyping it, is somewhat, well, simply a flying technological marvel. For example, buried up in its nose is an AN APG-77 radar set, which can track aircraft from up to 320 miles away, which, to put it in perspective, means that an F-22 could be in the skies over London and detect a P-80 as far away as Edinburgh, Dublin, or Amsterdam. Further still, it's capable of tracking up to 100 targets independently, meaning that every P-80 ever made before the close of World War II could be up in the sky, and a single F-22 could keep tabs on the lot of them. Bear in mind too that the P-80 has no radar, and thus it had to depend upon ground-based radar and observation systems noting where the enemy was, which would relay that vague location to the cockpit via radio, at which point it'd have to move to said general area and try to find them visually before it could even think about moving in to engage. The difference in capability just with this one system is borderline unfathomable. Beyond just its radar, however, the F-22's avionics also include the AN/ALR-94 electronic warfare system, which allows it to detect the source of enemy radar signals by geolocating the source of incoming radar waves, allowing it to locate enemies while leaving its own radar completely turned off, thus aiding it remaining hidden. There's loads more of its avionics system that we could discuss to really drive the point home, but these two examples give you the idea. The difference between a P-80 and an F-22 are absolutely night and day. As for the matter of armaments, a similar disparity exists. For its brass chucker, the F-22 sports a 20mm M61A2 Vulcan cannon, as opposed to the mere M350 cal machine guns of the P-80. This fires at approximately 6,000 rounds per minute, compared to the mere 1,200 rounds per minute of the M3, which means that despite the P-80 sporting a whopping 6 M3s compared to the F-22's single M61A2, it was in reality only putting 1,000 or more rounds downrange per minute than the F-22, and they were machine gun rounds, not cannon rounds. And then there's the matter of missiles, as in guided rockets, which the P-80 flatly could not use. The F-22, all within its internal weapons bay, can carry 6 AIM-120 air-to-air missiles with a maximum range, model dependent, of more or less 100 miles, and a further 2 AIM-9 air-to-air missiles with a maximum range of 22 miles. So let's be really generous here and use the highest estimate that we could find and say that the P-80's M3 machine guns had effective ranges of 900 yards. That would mean that the F-22 is able to engage aerial targets at a range 195 times greater than the P-80. 195 times. As for the F-22's ground-pounding capabilities, like the P-80, it comes in the form of 2,000-pound bombs. But unlike the dumb bombs carried by the P-80s, i.e. bombs that you just aim, release, and they go on their merry way to do their thing without any further input, the F-22 carries smart bombs, i.e. bombs that are equipped with guidance systems that adjust their trajectory post-drop. These are accurate to a distance, give or take, of 10 meters, which compared to the more eyeball-it-and-pray approach to bombing with the P-80, is, well, it's a real big difference. And that's going to do for our technical comparisons. Naturally, there is way more that we could say about both of these aircraft. Happily enough to do an everything you need to know video about both of them, to be honest, but for our purposes today, this will do the job, as we have seen more than enough to be aware that a P-80, if it were to have the dust blown off it and chugged back into the sky for one last mission, simply wouldn't have a chance against an F-22. It would be an almost comical matchup in its sheer absurdity. The F-22 would simply blow the P-80 out of the sky way over the horizon, destroying it before the pilot even knew he was under attack. But while it's certainly useful to compare such radically different aircraft such as these, as it allows us to appreciate just how far aviation technology has come in the last 80 years, and let's be frank, such a far-fetched comparison is just macabrely interesting on a certain level, we shouldn't then jump to the conclusion that the P-80 was just a heap of junk. Instead, ultimately, we must keep both aircraft framed within their own context. And for the P-80, that context is mostly in its utility in allowing the US aerospace industry to catch up with the Europeans in the nascent stages of the jet age, because quickly, very quickly in fact, it found itself relegated to a junior position in the pecking order by newer, more sprightly American jet fighters. Take the North American F-86 Sabre, which entered service in 1949, for example. While very much P-80 adjacent in general capabilities, it was nearly 100 miles per hour faster, able to hit 687 miles per hour at sea level, compared to just 594, thanks in no small part to its drag-reducing swept wings. It also had a radar gun sight that automatically calculated the target's range and could carry up to 5,300 pounds of bombs compared to the P-80's mere 2,000 pounds. And then there were things like the North American F-100 Super Sabre from 1954, which was the first American fighter able to break the sound barrier in level flight and keep going up to a top speed of Mach 1.4, it's 924 miles an hour. It was an age in which aviation technology was progressing fast, and in the face of this wider situation, the P-80 was always going to be something whose time in the spotlight was brief. It did manage to soldier on until 1959 in US service, however, surviving in a niche as a gap plugger, a dependable, good enough fighter that could be called upon for situations where they didn't expect any of the Soviets' latest and greatest fighters, such as the MiG-15 and MiG-19, to suddenly appear from the clouds and royally spank it. Although, to be fair, if a pilot of sufficient techers happened to be behind the stick, it could still hold its own even against them, as demonstrated by a little incident on the 8th of November 1950 during the Korean War, when Lieutenant Russell J. Brown managed to kill a MiG-15 by diving on it from altitude and using gravity to level the speed playing field. Incidents such as these, however, are the exception, not the norm, and generally speaking, as soon as faster and more technologically advanced jets began appearing in the late 40s and early 50s, the P-80 was obsolete. As for the F-22, well, it's certainly fair to say that it could well be the single best fighter jet that has ever been in the sky. Such a claim is a touch bold, of course, but come on. There's a reason it is the benchmark for a modern fighter jet, with article after article being published that look at aircraft such as Russia's Su-57 and China's J-20 and positing questions to the extent of, is it just an F-22 copy? With that insane performance we laid out earlier, there is simply nothing else that compares to it. The real peculiarity of the F-22 is that, for its unreal capabilities, it actually had a damn dull service life. It's been deployed overseas a few times to places as varied as both Japan and the Middle East, but overall, it's barely seen combat. A few were used to conduct airstrikes in Syria in 2014, and that's kinda it. It has, however, managed to score a single air-to-air kill, kind of, as it did shoot down a Chinese spy balloon in February 2023, even getting a kill marker in commemoration, but that's literally it for aerial combat. So that's the P-80 and the F-22, the $110,000 jet and the $350 million jet. So, what can we take away from all of this? Well, obviously, on a certain level, it is utterly ridiculous to compare them, something which we have made no attempt to hide throughout this video. But if we look beyond the mere surface-level specification sheet comparison, as we've been doing for this entire video, we come away having learned something very useful indeed. That being that, yes, the cost of jets has indeed ballooned to utterly insane levels since the black and white days, but the capabilities of them might have ballooned by an even more absurd degree. And it's only when you see a direct one-to-one comparison that suddenly that enormous leap in technology is really easy to appreciate. Don't forget, there's only 60 years between these two aircraft. 60. It's not even the length of a single human lifespan. And they improved by that much. It is legitimately almost unbelievable. And with that, there's only one thing to say before we close. Well, we'll see you all back here in 2055 so that we compare the antiquated, obsolete, absolute junk F-22 to whatever the hell they cook up to replace it.